However, it's essentially non-representative things are ruling the roost. So it's a very interesting kind of versatile mix that is taking place. Now let's go, I'm going to confine this dialogue basically not to the Caliphate etc. but to the 21st century. And the 21st century, Afghanistan, 2001 9/11 was a very, very important firebreak because Afghanistan 9/11 revealed the danger, the strategic threat posed by Wahhabi extremism. The Taliban are an ultra-Wahhabi group. Till now, till then people would say, for example, when, I remember when I used to go to US, etc., and meet people there, and they would say, well, Kashmir, give it freedom. So what? It doesn't make a difference. The reality is that they want freedom so that they can put people, women, where women, according to Sri Ram Sena, belong. They want a completely Wahhabi state in Kashmir. But that was not mentioned. They wanted freedom. So that came in the dialogue. So the fact of the matter is, 9/11 really revealed the security threat that is caused by Wahhabism and created a kind of a different perception of Wahhabism in the Western world. For the first time, the West realized Wahhabism is an existential threat not only in Asia, not only in Muslim minority societies. It could be a serious security threat inside the Western world as well. So in that sense, 9/11 was a very important point. But within the Arab world, more than 9/11, it was the invasion of Iraq that created a huge series of tectonic shifts. The first tectonic shift was the weakening of the Ba'athist tendency and the Ba'athist Nasserite ideology. Nasser himself was severely weakened after 1967. Nasserite ideology was an ideology of Arab nationalism. It was an secular Arab nationalism. And it was a national that, look, we should be proud of ourselves. We are Arabs. We should live in harmony with each other. We should be secular. We should have Jewish people, Christian people, give them equal rights. And Nasserite Egypt was a country where definitely, I would say, Christians and Jews were treated extremely well in Egypt. But that took a huge hit after the 2003. The so-called secular ideology of Baathism took a huge hit. And with the downfall of Iraq, what came up was a new Shia power. Till that time, in the Arab world, Iran and the Shia cause really had not much relevance. It's only Iran. You had Shia, you have got a large number of Shia in Saudi Arabia. Actually, no one is quite aware of what the actual population totals are because people just don't tell. You go to Saudi Arabia, you go to Bahrain, you go to elsewhere, people are just reluctant to give you exact figures of who are Shia, who are Sunni, who are Christian, whatever it is. But a rough guess is that even in Saudi Arabia, nearly about, definitely a fourth and tending towards a third of the people are Shia. In the case of Bahrain, more than 70% are Shia. All I can say is more than 70%. In the case of Kuwait, it's about 1/5. In the case of Qatar also, significant proportions. All over the Middle East, you've got Shia minorities. Everywhere. You have Kurdish minorities in Turkey. You have Kurds are Sunni, but extremely moderate Sunni. They are, if I may say so, they are the best exemplars of Sufi religion, of the Sufi faith, Sufi branch of Islamic faith are Kurds. You don't find a fanatic, a religious fanatic among the Kurds very easily. It's very difficult to find that. They are in Turkey, they are in Iran, they are in Syria. So you've got the Kurdish people. You have the Shia. You had these two sets of people who were fundamentally discriminated against and disenfranchised throughout the area. The Kurds were discriminated against everywhere, and the Shia were discriminated against everywhere except in Iran. And they were discriminated against even in Afghanistan, frankly. The Taliban was extremely merciless toward them. They discriminated against in Pakistan. They discriminated against, in this entire arc of YouTube. But let's focus on West Asia. Let's not talk about the subcontinent with this thing. The Iraq war brought with it a change of regime in Iraq. Now, obviously the Americans could not stay there indefinitely. And in fact, in my personal view, they stayed there far too long. If you look at the Bangladesh campaign in India, India went into Bangladesh. It, quote unquote, helped the Bangladeshis liberate their own country with a certain degree of resistance. And in a matter of months, the entire army went back to India. That is a normal, sensible army would do that. An army would not remain behind the way the US army unfortunately remained behind in Iraq. Not only did it remain behind in Iraq, but they put up an American administrator and an Iraqi advisor in Iraq. Now, as I said, we go by perceptions, we go by reality and by hype. If anybody in Washington had any knowledge of the kind of tensions that are there now, they would have put an Iraqi administrator with an American advisor. Everybody on television talking about Iraq was American or European or they were French, they were British, with the odd Arab standing in the corner and being completely silent. Iraqis, of course, never to be seen. You may have a Jordanian there, you may have a Qatari, you may have a Kuwaiti. Their job is to be stage props. They are silent. Then you've got Paul Brenner and a few others talking about we are going to do this and we are going to do that. And quite frankly, that kind of a perception created a total revulsion in the Arab world, a perception that colonialism has come back. Another mistake that, as I said, if you check back my record on the US, Davinder, you'll find I'm a very good friend of the US. A large part of these Indo-US organizations have come because a lot of activity of people like me. But then I'd like to say that another huge mistake was involving the British in Iraq. Now you had a few divisions there, but the psychological reality is the British were the colonial masters of Iraq. The Iraqis, tomorrow, for example, if we have British troops coming to India with guns and all that shooting up, there's going to be a certain amount of hectic activity in India, which is not entirely be friendly. They're not going to like it because those colonial feelings are still there, deep inside one's skin. And getting the British over, the Americans immediately gave it an imperialist kind of color. The British are back, the colonialists are back, the imperialists are back. America by itself is not seen as an imperial country. It had a little bit of problems in Philippines, so that's not really taken very seriously. The reality is America was never seen as an imperial country, except that post-war America, beginning with Harry Truman, identified itself totally with the Europeans, including European colonization in Vietnam, Southeast Asia, Africa, elsewhere, the Middle East. So Harry Truman, I would say Franklin Roosevelt, was completely different. Franklin Roosevelt supported Indian independence, he supported freedom movements, he was non-ethnic in his views, but Harry Truman came from a background which was a little more, if I may say so, provincial. And as a result, he identified the US completely with France, with the UK, with Holland, with all the colonial empires of Europeans. And since then, the Americans have suffered from the same kind of negativism that is there in the European powers, because of the identification of European powers. So, Iraq, number one, it excited a feeling that colonialism has come back to the Arab world. Two, it destroyed the Baathists as a force. The only Baathists left were in Syria, and they were not at all in a very strong position, so the Baathists as a force was completely destroyed. It strengthened the monarchies, definitely, because the allies of the monarchies, namely the NATO, America, Europe, etc., took over this thing. But overall, it created and most importantly, it ensured that the Shia in Iraq will finally take control of Iraq on the ground of democracy. Because fortunately, Iraq is today very definitely, I would say, a much better place than it was during Saddam Hussein's time. Despite the fact that it's been wrecked by the sanctions, by the post-Kuwait invasion sanctions, by the war, etc., still Iraq is a much better place today than it was in Saddam Hussein's time. For the simple reason that it is now evolving towards a democratic society. And obviously the majority population of Iraq, which is Shia, have got the upper hand in the governance of Iraq. So it is now, apart from Iran now, you've got another very large Shia-controlled state, and that is Iraq. You have another state which is semi-controlled by Shia, which is Lebanon, and you have another state which is semi-controlled by Shia, which is Syria. So this is now the quadrant that is now developing. When you see the situation that is developing now, if you go back to the Arab Spring, you go back to this thing, let me first talk about it's not a coincidence that today the battle lines are drawn between Iran, Syria. To some extent, there's a lot of negativism about Iraq, because Iraq is definitely backing Syria in this whole thing, and a large amount of attention in Lebanon. Essentially, it is becoming a Shia-Sunni kind of thing, or a Shia-Wahhabi kind of conflict, in which willy-nilly NATO is taking the side of the Wahhabi. So, in my personal view, this is a huge mistake. In 1982, Ariel Sharon made the mistake in Lebanon of siding with the Maronite Christians against the Shia. Today, Israel is the only country in the world where Shia terrorism is active. The Shia are not really, there's no Shia terrorism in India, in Europe, in the United States, any part of the world except Israel. And that is directly rooted to the 1982 decision of taking sides with the Maronite Christians against the Shia. Mr. Sharon's decision, I think it was a very unfortunate decision. And I speak as someone who is, even in Tehran, I have announced very clearly, I am a very strong supporter of Israel and a very great admirer of Israel. So that was a huge mistake. Today, the West is repeating that mistake on a global level. Today, it is repeating that mistake by confronting the Shia. So tomorrow, Shia terrorism is going to be in Europe, it's going to be in America, it's going to be all over the place, and they're going to add that to Wahhabi terrorism. India, for example, we are friendly to Iran, not friendly enough, frankly. Manmohan Singh has been far too, adjusting to various, advice that he's been getting. One very important reason why we are friendly to Iran is we don't want a second front of terror. We have a very vigorous ultra-Wahhabi terror track in India. Very vigorous. We don't want a Shia, ultra-Shia, Khomeinist, whatever you call it, terror track in India. And Iran has got the same amount of access to various groups in India as the Saudis have, as other people have. So we don't want to get a second front in the war on terror. That is reason one. Reason two, Iran is our road and rail access to Central Asia. Pakistan, which is a very strong ally of NATO, which is a major non-NATO ally, denies us access to Central Asia. Iran gives us access to Central Asia. And the third, of course, is that Iran is a very important supplier of hydrocarbons. So, for these three reasons, India and Iran are and will remain very good friends, and India is not going to participate in any activity against Iran. While being a friend of Israel, it remains a friend of Iran for these three reasons. One, the Shia factor. Two, access to Central Asia. And three, the hydrocarbon factor. But today what we are seeing is, why is the targeting of the Assad regime in Syria? The targeting is because Syria, again, it is very hard for me to, I go to Syria multiple times, go to Iran several times, I've been to Damascus several times. I can tell you it's becoming a little now. In the old days, going to Damascus was less dangerous than walking on a Delhi road. Now it is about the same level of danger as walking on a road in some parts of UP. It's a little more dangerous than about 5 or 6 months ago. It's getting more and more dangerous because of this civil war that's taking place there. But the Assad, Bashar Assad, is an Alawi. And Alawi is a Shia. And not only a Shia, but an extremely westernized group of Shias. You will never find an Alawi girl in a burqa. They're always dressed in denims, western clothes, western dress, and most Alawis like their evening nightcap. The extremely liberal version of the faith. It's very interesting that this liberal version of the faith is being demonized by the West, demonized by Europe and America, and Wahhabis, the Saudis, the Qataris, hardcore Wahhabis, who certainly very different from that, who don't wear denim, at least in public, they are the good boys in the eyes of the West. For me, sociologically, it's hard to understand, frankly. People like us, you dislike. People not at all like you, you like. It's very difficult. And of course, Mr. Sarkozy was very fond of, he's very, very fond of people, the whale, outside France. He supports the most hardline extremists he supports in Libya. He supported that in various parts. He's very strong support to the Wahhabis, Saudi Arabia. But in France, of course, he doesn't like the whale. So, in a sense, it's double standard. If the veil is wrong, it's wrong everywhere in the world. If it's not wrong in Saudi Arabia, it's not wrong in Paris. And I happen to believe that one has to have freedom to dress what you like. I mean, if you want to wear that, for heaven's sake, wear it. But there should be no compulsion, whether from your parents or from your school or something, to wear or not wear any aspect of dress. But today what we are saying is a very, very interesting thing. We are now, Bashar Assad is an Alawi. He's a Shia. Unfortunately, I don't regard the Western media as being particularly good at getting a situation report about what's happening. Because Western media seems to be heavily guided accidentally by Western, if I may say so, foreign ministries and strategic think tanks, etc. Nobody ever mentions the fact that Mr. Assad's wife is a Sunni. Nobody ever mentions the fact that half the Assad family are Sunni. Many of his cousins and nephews are Sunni. Some of them are Christian. For example, recently the defense minister of Syria was killed. Nobody has ever mentioned the fact that he was a Christian. Asma Assad is still a Sunni. She's not a Shia, she's not converted. And there's a very easy kind of interflow between Shia and Sunni in Syria. Fortunately, I think is very, very healthy. I think any kind of schism is wrong. And I'm surprised that that you can find me a single publication in the US or Europe which says that which identifies Asma Assad as a Sunni. Please show it to me. I have trawled through the net. I haven't been able to find any such reference. So you're painting it as basically Iran is Shia, Assad is a Shia. They are friendly to each other. So it's a Shia conspiracy to take over Syria. Now, as I said, Syria is one state I can tell you. In Iran, there is definite discrimination against people who are not Shia. In Saudi Arabia, there is discrimination against people who are not Wahhabi. Forget Sunni, who are not Wahhabi. But in Syria, the intelligence agencies are heavily Alawi. That's a fact. That is from the time of Bashar Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, the intelligence agencies are dominated by Alawis. People say in India, the intelligence agencies are dominated by Malayalis. People from Kerala. The J.N. Dixit was the first national security advisor to this government was a Malayali. The second chap, N.K. Narayanan, was a Malayali. The third chap, Shivshankar Menon, is a Malayali. And God knows who the fourth is going to be. But he's likely to be a Malayali. But in the same way as Malayalis seem to have some kind of access to the intelligence systems in India, the Alawites have. But if you look at the army, you look at the administration, look at everywhere, you've got Sunni, Shia everywhere. You've got Christians, you've got Sunni, you've got Shia, you've got Druze. For example, the Druze are Muslim, but they believe in reincarnation. Now, it's hard to reconcile that with the fundamental tenets of the Islamic faith, but they are staunch believers in reincarnation. And when you go to a Druze house and they see somebody from India, they want to enter into an involved argument on reincarnation. I knew this from one of my earliest visits to Syria. I went to a Druze mountains to meet a Druze chieftain. He was the spiritual leader. And he started engaging me in a discussion on reincarnation. I'm sorry that I didn't really do much reading up on that, so I wasn't very helpful as an interlocutor, but they fully believe in that. So this kind of tapestry of different beliefs is there in Syria. Now, so when we talk about Syria as a radical regime, it is because it is definitely supporting certain radical groups that are anti-Israel. There is no question. It supported Hamas actively. Hamas was based in Damascus, and then of course Hamas left, and now it's gone to Qatar, by the way, and it's still, doing whatever it did in Damascus. It is still doing, now that its headquarters is in Qatar. It's still Hezbollah, it has been backing fully, there's no question about it. They've been doing that. But that is more in a sense of rivalry with the monarchies, etc. It's in my personal view, there's a kind of an adjustment between Israel and Syria. So both sides understand each other, both sides know each other, and if I were an Israeli, I'd be extremely worried about what's happening in the Arab world in general and what's happening in Syria in particular. Because Assad was, you may call him the known devil. You knew him, you had the limits, you had red lines, and both sides went to red lines. You're getting a completely bunch of unknown players there. So again, now what is happening now globally is that NATO is now coming out as an anti-Shia force. In Iraq, the Bush administration and the Obama administration has put a lot of effort into telling Mr. Nouri al-Maliki that look, you must give enough oil revenue to the Sunni. You must have at least 40% of the investment must go to Sunni areas. That's fine. That's perfectly okay because Sunni are an important component of Iraq. But in Saudi Arabia, where you got a large number of Shia, no US official is going around telling the King Abdullah, why don't you produce, why don't you have more schools in the Shia areas? Why don't you give more scholarships to Shia students? I haven't heard of any US official talking about the Shia. They're talking about